Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show, there is a certain team I wanted to talk about that has really caught my eye as of late, and that would be a team in the AFC South, the team that actually won the AFC South this past season, and that is Bill O'Brien, Deshaun Watson, and the Houston Texans. And I think with this Houston Texan team, there's obviously a bunch of things to talk about. We all remember that this team decided to build around Deshaun Watson, and that obviously ended up to be the right decision, and they had DeAndre Hopkins, they had J.J. Watt, but for some reason, I don't feel like a lot of people really ever considered the Houston Texans to be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. And last year, I don't think they were that far off. Obviously, not a lot of people trust Bill O'Brien in a huge game as a coach because he hasn't really won much in the postseason yet. But at the same time, he has gotten the Houston Texans to the playoffs a couple times since he's been their head coach, and even a couple times before Deshaun Watson was his starting quarterback. But at the same time, everything that has gone down for the Houston Texans from the end of the AFC Championship game to now really hasn't been good. I think Deshaun Watson is one of the 3 or 4 best quarterbacks in the whole National Football League. And when he's on your team, he has the ability to win you games by himself. He has the ability to make other players around him much better. And I think as a quarterback, there isn't really a bigger compliment you could get with that than that. The only problem is, I don't know if the Houston Texans are really built the right way around him, and I'm literally talking about that in every aspect. Bill O'Brien is an okay to decent coach, but this is also a guy that ran a fake punt in the AFC Championship game that really gave the Kansas City Chiefs momentum to come back. Keep in mind, this Houston Texan team, when you're up 24-0 in any game, let alone the AFC Championship game, even if it's on the road, and even if you see Patrick Mahomes as the opposing quarterback on the other sideline, I just don't think there's any legit reason why you should lose that game. And I have a small feeling that going into next season, it could kind of cost the Houston Texans. I'm going to ask you guys, do you guys think the Houston Texans are a playoff team next year? Because let me give you guys the first 3 games for Houston in 2020. At Kansas City on the opening night of the season. If Arrowhead Stadium has fans, it's going to be rocking. We know that the Kansas City Chiefs are obviously the defending Super Bowl champions. We know they have the best young player in the league in Patrick Mahomes. And even though the Texans have Deshaun Watson, that is obviously a very tough game to start the season. And then they, in week 2, host the Baltimore Ravens. And a fun fact about the 2020 Houston Texans, they're going to be the first team in the National Football League since the 2005 Baltimore Ravens to start off the season against the last 2 MVPs of the National Football League. Houston is starting their season at Kansas City and home Baltimore, and right now, those are really the 2 best teams in the AFC. I don't think anyone is really going to say otherwise. So the fact that Houston starts off their season like that is obviously a killer. They then go to Pittsburgh and host Minnesota. So there's a very good chance the Houston Texans are going to start off 2-2 at best, maybe 1-3. I'm personally very high on the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you've listened to the show, you will know that. So that's obviously not an easy game. And then hosting Minnesota isn't easy either. That's really a 50-50 game. And the thing is, I just don't know if Deshaun Watson is enough to lead the Houston Texans to the playoffs because obviously the Texans have Laramie Tunsil. That's a very good offensive lineman. They invested a lot in him, and he's a very good player. But besides him, I really don't trust the Houston Texans offensive line, and the Texans really just haven't done a good enough job protecting Deshaun Watson. In terms of his weapons, I like Brandon Cooks, and I think that trade was fine, besides the fact that you gave up a second-round pick to get him, and that's basically what you got back for DeAndre Hopkins. If I'm a Texan fan, that whole DeAndre Hopkins, Bill O'Brien saga just really would still get under my skin because it really would have made me felt that my coach isn't doing everything he can to put the best team possible on the field. And by coach, I also mean GM, because I just don't think, unless your name is Bill Belichick, that is a successful formula that you could expect to work consistently in the National Football League. I just don't think Bill O'Brien, 1, has done enough to earn the GM job, or 2, should even have to worry about that. He should have to worry about, playbooks and game plans and putting his players in the best position to succeed, not players' contracts, and especially when you have a young quarterback on the books that's going to be coming up, whose contract is going to be expiring within the next couple of years. I'm curious to see, if Deshaun Watson is going to really want to stay around in Houston for the near future, because since DeAndre Hopkins has been traded, Watson has done a good job, looking good. He hasn't really thrown anyone under the bus, hasn't really commented on anything yet, but there's a difference between that and signing long-term to be the starting quarterback of a certain place. And it's not like Bill O'Brien is getting fired anytime soon, as a head coach at least, because once again, he has done a pretty good job leading the Houston Texans to the playoffs, even though they haven't really been able to explode for that one big-time moment yet. But it's going to be interesting to see, is Deshaun Watson going to want to stay in Houston long-term, especially if this season doesn't go as well as they plan? Also, the AFC South is kind of a tough division. The Indianapolis Colts last year, I believe, if they had good, consistent quarterback play, could have been a playoff team. They also really struggled with injuries. I love what they did in the draft, and they have one of the better offensive lines and one of the better defenses in the whole National Football League. And when you look at Houston, even though they have Deshaun Watson, DeAndre Hopkins is gone. Their other top receiver, Will Fuller, and Brandon Cooks have both had a really tough time over the last couple of years consistently staying healthy. The same thing has been the case with J.J. Watt. And besides J.J. Watt, the Houston Texans defense isn't really that good. I do not like their secondary at all. I think it was one of the worst secondaries in the whole National Football League last year. And they have some linebackers I like, Whitney Merciless, Zach Cunningham, both really good players. And I think they at least have made an effort to improve their offensive line when last year they brought in, Titus Howard. But at the same time, though, Houston has really traded all of their draft picks, and I don't really know if trading a second-round pick for Brandon Cooks, who's had a really tough time staying on the field over the last couple of years, is worth it, especially when you just traded away one of the top 2 or 3 best receivers in football in DeAndre Hopkins. And it's interesting because I don't think anyone's doubting it. Deshaun Watson is one of the best young quarterbacks in the National Football League, and I even think when you compare him to some of the guys like Carson Wentz that we just spoke about, or a Dak, or even a Lamar Jackson. I think Deshaun Watson, besides Pat Mahomes, is probably the best guarantee to be good out of any of the young quarterbacks in the National Football League. And he's so talented, he's so special. We all remember what he did throughout his college career at Clemson. I just don't think the Houston Texans have really done a good enough job in order to get the best out of him and really help him. And that doesn't really help when, you're in a tough division as well. You also have the Tennessee Titans, who were a win away from going to the Super Bowl last year. And here's the other thing with Bill O'Brien that if I were a Houston Texan fan, I really wouldn't be happy about, is that I totally understand the Houston Texans have won the last 2 AFC South titles. Bill O'Brien has made the playoffs in 4 out of his 6 years as the head coach in Houston, which is really good. But in the AFC South, you guys realize that over the past 3 seasons, since Bill O'Brien has been the coach, every AFC South team has had at least one AFC Championship game appearance besides the Houston Texans. That's kind of a problem. And I understand, it's, I don't want to say fluky, but you can't, in terms of, winning championships, you're not only going to judge and compare yourself to other teams in your division, but at the same time, there's no reason why this Houston Texan team with DeAndre Hopkins, shouldn't have made it. Deshaun Watson is that good of a player, and this past season, when you had a 24-0 lead in the AFC Championship game against the Kansas City Chiefs, and it was literally gone before halftime, that's a big problem. And if I was a Houston Texan fan, I really wouldn't be feeling very confident about the trajectory of my team. And then you look at the first 8 games of the season for Houston. All I'm going to say is they're lucky they have Jacksonville twice, because the first 8 games of the season for Houston is the following: at Kansas City, home Baltimore; at Pittsburgh, home Minnesota. That's got to be the toughest first 4 games out of anyone in the NFL. We spoke about it last week, how bad and how impactful and how hard the start of the Pittsburgh Steelers schedule was last year. I think the same thing can be said for the 2020 Houston Texans. They then host Jacksonville. Okay, that should be a win. Go to Tennessee. That's a tough game. Host Green Bay. That's a tough game. Go to Jacksonville. So besides 2 games against the Jaguars, The Texans' first 8 games consist of those 2 games, and at Kansas City, home Baltimore, at Pittsburgh, home Minnesota, at Tennessee, and home Green Bay. Following that, they go to Cleveland, they host New England, go to Detroit, host Indy, go to Chicago, go to Indy. Like, there are just not many easy games and wins for this Houston Texan team, and that just means that Deshaun Watson is really going to have to do his best to play his best, and Bill O'Brien and the rest of the team is going to really have to step up. And even though Deshaun Watson is capable of leading the Houston Texans by himself, it's just very hard to expect that, especially when you consider, like, the things about Indianapolis and Tennessee, those 2 teams in particular, right? And I will admit, right now, I tend to favor both of those teams over Houston is because they are just more team-oriented. You see that Indianapolis has so many different units and components of their team that could beat you and that are better than Houston. Indianapolis has the coaching advantage over Houston. I think Indianapolis clearly has the defense and offensive line advantage over Houston. And when you consider the weapons that Indianapolis added in the offseason, not only at quarterback and Phillip Rivers, but Pittman and Jonathan Taylor as well to go along with Marlon Mack and some of the other guys they had last season, combined with Tennessee and how they just rode Derrick Henry and his legs all the way to the AFC Championship game. If I was a Houston Texans fan, I would be a little concerned about my team for this upcoming season.